Oh yeah. All right, what's up everybody? Welcome to Mostly Pizza. I'm Ivan and I'm going to be making a basic dough today that will be good for any type of pizza, like a New York style pizza or California style pizza. So I like to measure out all my ingredients ahead of time just to make sure I have all the right ingredients to put in at the right time. It's not super technical, but at the end of the day, the care that you put into preparing your dough, the better the flavor comes out in the end. Something to keep in mind is you always want to use a scale to weigh your ingredients. You don't want to use a measuring cup. So for this recipe, it's going to be good for a couple of 13-inch pizzas. So we're going to start off with 453 grams of flour. This is All Trump's high gluten flour. You could use an all-purpose flour of any kind if you like. I prefer this flour. You can buy it in bulk and it's probably less expensive than the standard like King Arthur or gold medal flour. And I like to be as precise as possible. So 453 on the nose. Next up, we're gonna do the water. Now we're gonna have two different types of water. We're gonna have one water that will be the warm water, and this will be used to help activate the yeast. That will give us a better rise in our dough if we activate the yeast appropriately. So we're going to do 70 grams of warm water. It's a little bit high. 70 exactly on the nose. 8 seconds, and yeah, it's nice and just barely above room temperature. I microwave my water because we have a tankless water heater and it takes forever for the warm water to get up to temperature. And instead of wasting all that water just to get the water up to temp, this takes just a couple of seconds. So we have our 70 grams of warm water. And then I'm going to combine that with 4.5 grams of dry active yeast. I use the Fleischmann's. You can use whatever you can find right now, but whatever you can find at the supermarket is just fine, just a dry active yeast. So we're gonna do 4.5 grams. All right, so we have our 70 grams of water plus our 4.5 grams of active yeast. Now, most people just say, leave it here, let it sit, it'll do its thing, it'll rise, or it'll get bubbly and yeasty and smell fantastic. I like to give it a little boost to get it activated. And so what I do is I use a fork, kind of just as a whisk, and I will whisk it up for about 30 seconds. And this just gives it a little boost to get it activated a little bit more. You don't have to do this, not important, but what you will want to see is a little foaminess occurring after about a few minutes. This just kind of gets that party started a little bit faster, and set that aside for about 30 seconds to let activate further. Next, we're going to just do 225 grams of iced water. All right, there's our iced water. Set that aside. Next up, we're going to use our dry malt powder. This is a diastatic malt. This gives it a lot more, it gives it an interesting flavor adder to it. We're going to add about 9 grams of the diastatic malt powder. It's not very much, but it goes a long ways. And we're just going to add that directly into our flour that's already there. Next up is a fine sea salt. We're going to add that during the mixing process. We're going to do about 9 grams. Perfect. And finally, we're going to add our extra virgin olive oil. Get a good olive oil. It'll go a long ways. For this dough, there's not a ton. There's 5 grams of olive oil for this setup. Now, what's interesting though is every time I've ever poured the olive oil from one of these dishes into that while it's mixing, there's always a lot of residue. So I always like to go a little bit over. So I'm going to put about 6, maybe 7 grams of olive oil in here. And we did way too much. So I'm just going to mix in that diastatic malt that I had in here earlier, just to make sure it's evenly incorporated before I get the dough in the mixer started. I'm gonna wait a little bit longer because our yeast hasn't fully activated yet. We have some nice bubbles forming here, but I feel like it can still go a little bit longer. Make sure you got some bubbles forming. Make sure you can smell it. Make sure it looks like it's having some activity. Once it's at that point, that's when I get the dough started. First step is you're gonna wanna put all the dry mixture in there, just the flour and the diastatic malt. From there, we'll just set the mixer to the lowest possible setting. You don't need it to be high. So you wanna set it to the very lowest setting. That way you can kind of control the speed of what's going on. So the first step is to go ahead and add your cold water. Now, don't add 100% of it. I'll tell you why in a second. But just go ahead and just pour it in. And leave just a little bit at the bottom. Because what you're going to do next is you're going to add your yeast mixture. And you're going to pour all of that in, 100%. But you see that there's like a little bit of residue in there still. We want all of that yeast mixture. So we're going to go ahead and give that leftover water. Swirl it up a little bit. So we get all that good stuff, and then pour it all in. We're gonna let this go for about a minute, and then we're gonna add the salt. All right, we're good enough. Nice little dry mixture there. So we're about a minute, 2 minutes in for mixing. At this point, we're gonna start adding our salt. Just go ahead and pour that in. I like to make sure the dough is off the hook to make sure we start off at a neutral point again. And if you have any dough or flour stuck to the sides, now is a good time to kind of scrape that off too. A neutral point again. And again, I just use a spoon just because it keeps my hands cleaner. I like my hands really clean, which is kind of weird when you like making this much pizza all the time. I just prefer it. So here we're gonna add our 5 grams of olive oil. Now I had a little bit extra in here, so I'm just gonna pour about half of that amount in here. That's good. All right, and then we're gonna go back. If you don't have a dough scraper, definitely get one. At this point, it's looking pretty good. It's a sign when you've done the right ingredients at the right stages and in the right quantities that there's nothing really stuck to the bowl, which is pretty awesome. Now it's going to be a little bit sticky. That's okay, because we're going to also knead the dough to make it into its final form before it sits to rest for a few hours. I'm going to scrape out the dough, just like that. It is a little sticky right now. And you're going to put this onto an unfloured surface, because we don't want to add any dryness to this at this stage yet. It's going to feel sticky at first, but what we're going to do is we're going to knead the dough for about 2 to 3 minutes. So we're going to let the dough rest for about an hour. That extra olive oil I had, that was close. It actually did not spill in there. That extra olive oil I have, we're going to just go ahead and pour that in just a little bit. So that way we have a nice slick surface for the dough to rise in. Just like that. And then we're going to place our dough, which did not stick, yay, right inside. Nice and gently. Then I'll pour a little bit of olive oil right on top of that, just to make sure it doesn't get a crust. What happens is if your dough hits the air a little bit too much while it's resting, and there's not a good seal for your saran wrap on top, then what happens is it'll develop like this little crust, and that pretty much ruins your dough, and you gotta throw it out. So I like to cover it with olive oil, which helps protect it from that happening. Puts a little barrier there between the dough and the air. And then from there, we're gonna wrap it and let it sit for about an hour. Just make sure it's nice and tight. You don't want any air getting in there. Just make sure there's enough room in there for the dough to rise, because it will double, if not triple, in size. All right, we're gonna let that sit for about an hour. All right, now for our last step. The dough is proofed for a little bit more than an hour. Wanted to give it a little extra time because it's not that warm in here. But you can see it's gone up considerably in size. It smells amazing. The oil kept it nice and soft on the top here. And we're just gonna let that kind of come right out. Boom. Now we just need to weigh out about 370, 380 gram balls, and that'll be just enough for our pizza. So now we have our 2 balls. So in order to make sure that they have enough room to proof, we're just gonna roll them up in nice little balls. And you can even tighten up the bottom by just rotating it around, and we get a nice little dough ball. I'm gonna put that right on the pan. And same thing with this guy. And so we just want a little bit on there, each one. And this will prevent it from sticking to the plastic wrap as much as possible. All right, from here we want to make sure, again, a nice tight seal on the wrapping. There we go. That should be pretty good. All right, and from there, we just let it rest for 24 to 48 hours. The next video will be on us making pizza with this pizza dough. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe.